For it was not just an important trading center, but also a place of mystery and legend, a garden of immortality. But where was Dilmun? Men have been looking for Dilmun for 100 years, ever since its name was unearthed by archaeology a century ago. One man now thinks he's actually found it, an archaeologist called Geoffrey Bibby. And thereby he reckons he has also found paradise, the source of the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. He looks like some Arab sheikh, but actually he's an Englishman from Westmoreland who happens to work in Denmark. His quest for Dilmun took him to the Middle East, to an island in the Arabian Gulf, the oil-rich island of Bahrain, where archaeology and legend finally met face to face and started to make sense. It all started with the puzzle of the grave mounds. For years, scholars had believed that Bahrain had been used in prehistoric times simply as a cemetery, a vast necropolis for the peoples of mainland Arabia. Geoffrey Bibby and his Danish colleagues didn't find this theory convincing. There was very little evidence to go on. All the mounds that were archaeologically examined had been plundered by grave robbers in antiquity, so not much was known of the culture of those who had been buried there.
I bet it is, but still.
Digging them is apt to be a dusty, unrewarding business, but in the search for evidence, it must be done.
As good as any of them. Put the first one in there, I think. Yeah.
The chances of finding an unrobbed grave must be 1,000 to 1 at least. Yet every excavation, every mound they tackle, has to be meticulously recorded and surveyed. For in archaeology, every single detail can be vital.
Okay, now we start digging. ايه ونشيل الرمل هناك شمالي يلا عسل
Bibby knows before he starts that this is almost sure to be an academic exercise. After nearly 20 seasons in Bahrain, he knows better than to expect spectacular results from the field of grave mounds, any more than in the royal graves at Ali. The mounds at Ali are huge. Compared with the normal grave mounds, which are seldom more than the height of a man, the Ali mounds are as big as 3-story buildings. Each one has 2 huge chambers with carefully plastered walls. But these mounds, too, had been systematically robbed in antiquity. Faced with these colossal structures, with no evidence to go on except some broken pottery and beakers, Bibby and his colleagues came to the conclusion that they had once housed royalty, that this area was Bahrain's equivalent of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt.
They were obviously at least 3,000 years old. And we believe that they must mean that Bahrain had been, at some time in the past, a pretty important place.
Such were the homes of the dead. But what of the living? The first clue that Bahrain had been more than just a cemetery came from a number of chimneys that stuck out of the sand, a remarkable sight. They formed a line that led straight across the arid expanse of sand towards a walled enclosure. And inside, a sunken garden, a man-made oasis of growth now parched and desiccated, struggling to keep alive against the encroaching sand. It was an extraordinary thing to find in the middle of the desert, especially since there was not one but several of them. The question was, what on earth had it really been for?
Well, essentially, it's the source of an irrigation system. It's a natural spring, which is led through artificial underground channels down a few miles to the villages near the coast, where it's used for irrigation purposes.
So what were these chimneys that lead here? Inspection holes or something like that?
Yes, mainly. The channels need clearing out periodically. I think they were also used in actually in digging the channels.
The fascinating point emerged that the irrigation system had been built in the days before Bahrain had become a desert. The walls had been erected to keep the encroaching sand from smothering the spring. It gave some indication at least of how old this sunken garden must have been.
We knew it was of quite considerable age because it had been given up. The water table had sunk since it was built, and the water no longer reached the water channels. So we reckoned that it must be at least 2,000 years old, say, very roughly. The important thing wasn't perhaps how old it was, but the fact that it did show that there'd been people living here, that there'd been an agricultural community with a very well-organized water supply at some unspecified remote date in the past. And that made quite a difference to our picture of the island. And I think it was the first evidence we had that the theory that Bahrain was merely a desert island that was used as a burial place for people from outside just couldn't hold water.
The sunken garden had proved that people had lived on Bahrain. A mound near the village of Barbar to the north indicated where they had worshipped. This was the first large site the expedition tackled. What had attracted their attention originally was the fact that they had come across two squared stones protruding from the mound. It was the leader of the expedition, Professor Peter Globe, who was responsible for the dig. They sank a trench right through the middle, and almost at once they realized they had a major archaeological discovery on their hands. What they had found was a temple, huge squared stone walls, a stone altar, and in front of it, a pit full of votive offerings. One of them, a little figurine of a naked man about 6 inches high, his hands clasped in prayer. Another was a copper figurine of a plump bird. But the most significant find was a magnificent bull's head in copper, because by comparing it with bull's heads found throughout the Middle East, this find enabled the archaeologists for the first time to estimate the date of this civilization. The one it resembled most closely was a celebrated bull's head found by Sir Leonard Woolley on a lyre at Ur of the Chaldees. It showed that the Temple of Barbar had clear cultural connections with the ancient civilization of Sumeria at around 2000 BC. With this knowledge came the first realization that they might be looking at the long-lost, almost legendary world of Dilmun. When the temple had yielded its secrets, the site was covered over again with sand to preserve it for posterity and to discourage stone robbers who would have looted it for construction materials, for stone is scarce in Bahrain. And now, having discovered where the people of ancient Bahrain had worshipped, the next question facing Bibi was to find out where they had actually lived. From the mound at Barbar, they turned to the so-called Bahrain Fort, a ruined fortress built by the Portuguese in the early 16th century. It was Professor Peter Globe who discovered the next lead when he started examining the fort site properly.
It's surrounded on all sides by a raised hillock, about 30 feet high perhaps. And you can see still the outlines of walls running along the surface. And I suppose everybody had previously considered that these walls belonged to the time of the Portuguese. But considering it, Professor Globe decided that actually this could hardly be true. The towers of the fort had gun ports and arrow ports, and obviously there could not have been a town there at that time that would obstruct the field of fire. And it was quite obvious that what we had here was a tell.
A tell is an artificial mound built up of various layers of cities and civilizations. The Danes started digging. Almost at once, about 3 feet down, they came across massive stone walls lying at an angle.
We went down inside the wall. It cut down our sondage to about half the area, and there was only room, in fact, for Professor Globe and one of his men to work inside the limited area. And from there, they went down each day when we came along in the evening. They were another couple of feet down, and it just went down and down. We got no idea that we'd find walls of this massiveness, this completeness,
What did you find at the bottom?
Well, about 15 feet down, we found a floor. It's been dug away now. And in that floor, there were two holes. When we dug down in those, there were two bathtub-shaped coffins, sarcophagi of clay, with skeletons curled up inside.
Did that tell you anything about
Well, that was the first indication of date. We'd got no idea of the date of these walls then, but the coffins we knew. They had to be of Neo-Babylonian or Assyrian date, somewhere around 700 BC, perhaps. The trouble was that they were buried, as I say, through holes in the floor, so they were presumably not so old as the building in which they stood. So the building could be any date still, but it had to be older.
How did you eventually get round to dating the whole site?
Well, that didn't happen here, because here there wasn't room, because of the walls, to make a deep sondage. We went over to the edge of the tell, and there we dug a hole all the way down to bedrock.
The results certainly proved that it was a tell, but they proved far more. The profile of the sondage showed a series of strata with pottery associated with 3 different civilizations. At the top level, there was Greek pottery, then Kassite, and at the bottom, Barbar pottery, the same previously unknown dark red pottery found at the Barbar temple. It proved that people who worshipped there had also lived here.
Pottery is, in fact, the most important thing that the archaeologist has through his hands. It's the most common thing, and that's one reason for its importance. It's the odd thing about pottery that while it's intensely fragile, once it's broken, the shards never deteriorate, and while all organic material, even metal, disappears, you do get tens of thousands of shards. And because clay is so malleable, you do tend to get all sorts of shapes, all sorts of colors, all sorts of designs, and practically speaking, they never repeat themselves. So that if you get the same shape of pottery in 2 different sites, you can be fairly sure that that those 2 sites are of the same date and of the same culture.
And so, for the first time in 4,000 years, a Barbar pot was seen in its original shape. A long-necked pot, but fundamentally egg-shaped. And round it were chains of deep ridges formed by the potter pinching the clay with his fingers. The most common type of Barbar pot was even more elongated, unable to stand on its own base, and thick-rimmed at the neck. And finally, the sherds of a grave mound pot, of different shape, but the same deep red color. So the people who were buried in the grave mounds were the people who had worshipped at Barbar and lived at the fort site. The puzzle of the grave mounds was solved. But now a new and even more tantalizing question arose. For on a seashore on the south of the island, they found a great heap of oyster shells, and amongst them the familiar telltale red pottery of Barbar. So the oyster shells were 4,500 years old, and in them Bibi felt an echo of ancient Dilmun, for Dilmun had been famous for its pearls. And now the memory of a legend went through his mind, a legend that linked Dilmun and Sumeria. For in the Sumerian town of Uruk, 3,000 years before Christ, there had lived a king who was part man, part god. His name was Gilgamesh.
A goddess made him, strong as a savage bull. None can withstand his arms.
No human could stand up to him. So for sport, Gilgamesh would take on bulls and lions. The city of Uruk stood in awe of him and begged the gods to create someone to match his fearful strength. And so the gods created another monster, half man and half bull, to be his match. After some fighting, the two became bosom friends and shared a lifetime of adventures together. But when his companion died, Gilgamesh went to Dilmun to visit Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, the only human being who knew the secret of immortality which the gods had bestowed on him for saving mankind from the flood. Gilgamesh traveled by boat exactly the same kind of buoyant reed boat that the men of Bahrain use to this day. So Gilgamesh came to Dilmun to beg from Noah the secret of immortality.
Gilgamesh, I shall reveal a secret thing. It is a mystery of the gods that I'm telling you. There is a plant that grows under the water. It has a prickle like a thorn, like a rose. It will wound your hands. But if you succeed in taking it, then your hands will hold that which restores his lost youth to a man.
The flower of immortality was the pearl. From time immemorial, the pearlers of Bahrain have dived for oyster shells by tying weights to their feet to pull them down to the seabed. And this was precisely the method that Noah advised Gilgamesh to adopt. To pluck the flower of immortality, Gilgamesh sank to the seabed like a pearl diver and took the plant or pearl and brought it to the surface. And with the secret in his hand, he took his leave of Noah. But he was not to keep the secret for long, for on his journey out of Dilmun,
Gilgamesh saw a well of cool water, and he went down and bathed. But deep in the pool there was lying a serpent, and the serpent sensed the sweetness of the flower. It rose out of the water and snatched it away, and immediately it shed its skin and returned to the well.
And so, just as in the Bible, man held the secret of immortality and then lost it to the serpent. It all tied in with a curious find Professor Globe had made earlier on the floor of the City Tell. And now archaeology and legend met face to face.
It was in this hall, when Professor Globe was clearing up the floor, that he found about a dozen circular holes in the ground, less than a foot across. And clearing those out, came across, in each one of them, a bowl. They were clearly offerings of some sort. At the bottom of practically every one of them, there was the coiled up skeleton of a snake. In practically every one of them, there was, in addition to the snake, there was a bead. Several years went by before we realized the significance of these snake burials.
The pearl in antiquity had always been a symbol of rejuvenation. Cleopatra had crushed pearls in her wine. Now the pearl and the snake were associated in legend with Dilmun and in archaeological reality with Bahrain. And the common factor was this ruined city, which every year became larger and more impressive. Huge palaces with walls of stone 15 feet high. The evidence of a great and prosperous ancient civilization could no longer be ignored.
And this is the main
hall of the palace.
Presumably roofed, obviously.
Roofed, yes. With these are supports for probably wooden pillars with that held the roof. The stone from here is disappeared.
Well, in this hall, you found the first sort of intimation of Dilmun with the discovery of the snake pit, as it were, and the pearl. Was it sufficient to make you think, we've got Dilmun now?
In a way, it was leading us in that direction. It meant, of course, that we got an important place chronologically belonging to the time of Dilmun, and then we got this obvious, clear connection with Gilgamesh, whom the snake robbed of immortality in Dilmun.
I suppose it would be more accurate to say that here was a place which apparently remembered Dilmun.
Yes, exactly. It's the period when Dilmun still existed in the historical records. If this place was Dilmun, it was called Dilmun at this time. But it was here they had preserved a memory of the association of the snake and the pearl. They'd got the same feeling that the snake was at the same time a symbol of good luck, but something to be hated, something that had robbed a man of his heritage. That you get in the that's the theme of the Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh's association with Dilmun.
But this burial ritual was very much later than the writing down.
Yes, the Gilgamesh legend was written down about 2000 BC and was referring then to events that were supposed to have taken place 600 or 700 years earlier again. And this is 700 BC, about a good 2,000 years after Gilgamesh is supposed to have lived.
And it's lasting all that time.
And it lasted all that time.
Now, apart from this mythological association, Dilmun itself is said in the records to have been a great trading center. But pearl trading alone wouldn't have been sufficient to have made Bahrain as large a trading center as Dilmun clearly was from the documentary sources.
No, and of course Dilmun was said to be a trader in other things than pearls, a trader in things from many different parts of the world, particularly further east.
What was needed to clinch the association of Bahrain with ancient Dilmun was some practical evidence of widespread trade and commerce. And this evidence came 1 year during excavations at the city Tel, at a level that was yielding vast quantities of Barbar pottery. It was a discovery of a seal, a round, stamped seal made of steatite, the monogram, as it were, of the trader who had used it 4,500 years ago to set his mark upon his own products. It was to be the first of dozens of such seals, proving beyond doubt that Bahrain, like Dilmun, had been an extremely important trading center in ancient times. The variety of patterns used on the seals was immense. There were scenes of hunting, of domestic animals, of flowers. There were religious motifs. And then came a rare find, a piece of pottery with a seal impression on it, showing how a seal had been used to stamp a mark on an earthenware container. Traditionally, every seal had to be drawn by hand, meticulously by specialist artists, to catch the nuances of light and shade that the camera might miss. Meanwhile, their historical importance was becoming clearer. The really significant point about these seal finds was that they placed ancient Bahrain firmly and inescapably into the commercial context of the Middle East of this time, about 2500 BC. The seal, as a method of identification of goods, was recognized by every civilization of the time from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. A few round seals had been found previously, some at Ur of the Chaldees and some at Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, but nowhere in such tremendous numbers as they were turning up on Bahrain. In Mesopotamia, cylinder-shaped seals were usual. At Mohenjo-Daro, it was square seals that were traditional. The round seals proved that Bahrain had had extensive trading contacts with Sumeria and the Indus Valley. Bibi was now more and more convinced that in Bahrain he was in Dilmun, but he needed more strictly archaeological evidence. He found it when he started to excavate part of the old walls of the city Tel.
We came down to the top of a fortification wall in 1964. And as we came down, we found that the wall had been rebuilt after a destruction with reused stone set very loosely and very irregularly. And below, with a clean break, came the regular stonework of the Dilmun city wall, built by the Barbar people around about 4,000 years ago. As we went down, the wall ended, and below that we found the levels of the people who'd lived here before ever the wall was built. The city of the people before the wall had ended in a very clear destruction level. where we have a long and thick layer of ash covering the whole site. And below that, we have the settlement levels, the layers of rubbish and potsherds from the people whose city was later to be destroyed. And in 1965, we came across the gateway through the city wall. It was the gate that led into the city from the beach outside. And on either side lay two buildings which must have been some form of customs offices. For in one of them we found almost a dozen of the round steatite stamp seals, and in the other a series of marble weights.
The city gate, the customs houses, and now the marble weights all reinforce the evidence of the trading seals, that Bahrain in ancient times had been a significant trading centre like Dilmun. But it was finding hundreds of grains of imported copper in the earth around the customs houses that really clinched it. For copper had been the staple trade of Dilmun, and from the clearing houses on Bahrain, copper had gone by sea to neighbouring countries all around. The transactions were recorded on cuneiform clay tablets found last century in Mesopotamia.
9 fish eyes, 7 miners of copper of Manam Ki Sin, son of Uzi Danam.
2 2/2 miners, 5 shekels of copper. 4 shekels of copper of the Dilmunite.
27 1/3 miners, 6 shekels of copper,
10
12
white
shekels
stones,
of lapis lazuli.
25 stones.
For buying fish
26
eyes and other
fish
merchandise on an expedition to Dilmun, N has borrowed from
and thus
Idris.
satisfy the Anmianum.
Who is there amongst the Dilmun traders who has acted against me in this way? You have treated my messenger with contempt. And further, with regard to the silver that you have taken with you from my house.
Businessmen were ever thus. These vivid squabbles tell us very clearly of the trade that went on between Sumeria and Dilmun. But when the dhows went north to Sumer, they didn't go direct. On their way from Dilmun, they stopped at the little island of Failaka, which once had been a trading outpost of the mighty Dilmun Empire. It was only in 1958 that the Danish team added Failaka to the Dilmun Trail, when they found the unmistakable red Barbar pottery there amid the forgotten ruins of a settlement that had lived and died as a Dilmun trading agency. But in terms of the number of seals found, Bibi and one of his colleagues on the Failaka dig were surprised to find Bahrain left well behind. Over 400 more seals were found on Failaka, some showing vividly how closely the civilizations of Sumer and the Indus Valley had been linked through Dilmun.
And this is the one with Huberba, the wind goddess,
Yes.
and the, of course, with the bull at the bottom, just like the Indus
Yes.
seals. But Huberba from the Sumerian legend, the goddess of the winds. That's a perfect example of the mixture of the cultures. Yes, this is the best of them, of course. I think you had a wonderful artist in Kuwait at some time. There's several seals just like this with the very, very minute design on. And then, of course, with Gilgamesh on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beauty. And gold around, of course. Interesting one. And there you've got the bull again and the man holding the snake.
Yes.
It's odd how often on these seals, you get the man fighting the snake, I suppose.
The little figurines found at Failaka show that this small island off Kuwait had had very much its own culture at the time. Some of the faces are those of Easter Islanders. Some show Sumerian influence. And one manages to look astonishingly like Geoffrey Bibby himself. But the Bahrain influence was strong as well. For here too they found that distinctive Barbar pottery with the heavy rims, the deep red colour, the elongated necks. Once again it was the pottery that gave the lead in the trail, especially when Bibby began to try to work out just how extensive Dilmun must have been in ancient times. The new dig had stretched it from Bahrain to Failaka on the way to Sumer. The extension didn't surprise Bibby. There were sound trade reasons behind it. But Bibby suspected that Dilmun had been more than just an island centre. In 1941, grave mounds had been found in Saudi Arabia which were identical in structure to those of Bahrain. In 1966, Bibby found Barbar potsherds at Tarut on the coast of the Arabian mainland. There was no way of telling precisely how far up the coast the Dilmun influence had gone, but it couldn't have been as far as Sumer, for in between lay the land of Bit Iakin, the prey of the ancient kings of Assyria.
I brought under my sway Bit Iakin on the shore of the Bitter Sea as far as the border of Dilmun. And Uperi, king of Dilmun, whose abode is situated like a fish, 30 double hours away in the midst of the sea of the rising sun, heard of the might of my sovereignty and sent his gifts.
Bibby knew that Dilmun's power had been growing because the temple itself had been growing throughout this period. And it was the Barbar temple, in fact, that gave Bibby the first indication of a direct connection between Bahrain and the biblical story of Eden.
When they cleared the south wall, there was something very much more significant. A flight of stone steps leading downwards to a square stone enclosure with a tank of water in the bottom. It was a natural spring, and I think it's very likely that its presence there was, in fact, the reason why the temple was built in that spot.
That was a crucial clue, a freshwater spring. It was fresh water that was at the heart of the mystique that shrouded Dilmun. At Bahrain, there is an abundance of freshwater springs that bubble up not just on land, but even on the seabed. Now, in the Sumerian legends, there lay beneath the saltwater sea another ocean, an abyss, a freshwater sea that geologists now know corresponds with uncanny accuracy to the way in which the water table of Arabia tilts and breaks surface on and around Bahrain. It was this precious resource of fresh water in a parched area that gave Bahrain its strategic importance, and which ultimately clinched for Bibby the association with the Dilmun of paradisal legend. And it was this fresh water from under the sea that we were now attempting to fetch with the help of the local Sabaqua team armed only with a plastic bag.
Let's taste it.
And there really was fresh water welling up from the seabed off Bahrain. According to the legend, these submarine freshwater springs were the work of a Sumerian god. His name was Enki, the god of wisdom and the abyss of fresh water underneath the sea. He had a son called Inzak, and the name of Inzak appears in an inscription found on Bahrain in 1879. This was the first clue linking Inzak and Enki with Bahrain.
Palace of Rimum, servant of the god Inzak, man of the tribe of Agarum.
Then on the island of Failaka, a seal turned up that named Inzak as Lord of Dilmun. The Inzak connection led Bibby back to Enki and the oldest story in the world, the Sumerian story of paradise, when Enki, god of the freshwater abyss, lived in Dilmun at the beginning of time, long before Noah was brought there after the flood. Only one thing was lacking to make paradise complete for Enki and the sister goddess with whom he shared this garden of immortality, and that was water. So Enki gave Dilmun water, and thus was created the oldest written story in the world, older by far than Genesis.
The land of Dilmun is holy. The land of Dilmun is pure. The land of Dilmun is clean. The land of Dilmun is holy. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry. The wild hen utters not the cry of the wild hen. The lion kills not. The wolf snatches not the lamb. Unknown is the kid-devouring wild dog. Unknown is the grain-devouring boar. The dove droops not the head. The sick-eyed says not, I am sick-eyed. The sick-headed says not, I am sick-headed. Its old woman says not, I am an old woman. Its old man says not, I am an old man.
But what made it really paradise was Enki's divine gift of running water. The Sumerian story of paradise was written down some 2,000 years before the birth of Christ and well before the Genesis story of Adam and Eve was recorded for the first time. So it looks as if the Genesis writers might have borrowed the story of Eden, like some other legends, from the Sumerians.
Perhaps one of the best examples of cultural borrowing is the story of the flood, where the Sumerian story is almost identical with that of the Bible, except that the hero is, in the Sumerian version, Ziusudra, instead of Noah. It occurs, of course, in a lot of other countries in the world, too, but the Bible and the Sumerian story are almost alike. And here you have the significant, for us, detail that when Ziusudra is granted immortality by the gods, when the flood goes down, he at the same time is translated to the land of immortality, to Dilmun.
Well, now, how does one connect Dilmun with the Garden of Eden?
Quite a number of ways. There's, first of all, the question that the fact that Dilmun was a land of plenty, a land blessed with water and with all vegetation, a land that's quoted in the Enki legend as being a land of immortality, no sickness, no death, the lion doesn't eat the lamb, that sort of thing. There's the story of Enki eating the 7 forbidden plants in Dilmun.
Just like the forbidden fruit?
Just like the forbidden fruit. And being cured by the creation of 7 gods and goddesses, of whom one, Ninsicula, it has a name that some people translate as Lady of the Rib. And then, of course, Dilmun, later on in another story, was the place where the snake robbed man of immortality, where Gilgamesh lost the flower that he'd fished up from the bottom of the sea to the snake.
Did the writers of the biblical account of the Garden of Eden simply crib the idea of a Dilmun as a land of plenty?
They don't name Dilmun. They don't name the Garden of Eden as an island. I feel rather they were abstracting from a body of legend of the beginning of things that told that there was a garden in the east where man at one time had been blessed, a garden that had all the things that they lacked in their everyday life.
But archaeologists cannot live on legends alone, however tempting and romantic they may be. Always Geoffrey Bibby and his colleagues from Denmark and his Arab fellow workers have to come back to the hard, dusty realities of excavation work, of handfuls of rice for lunch, liberally mixed with desert grit, of heat and grime and drudgery. Compared with paradise, Earth can be barren and parched. Yet in this unspectacular groundwork of archaeology, so demanding of effort and concentration, there is a comradeship which archaeologists learn to cherish. In the dust of the grave mounds, Geoffrey Bibby from Westmoreland and his Danish colleagues become as one with their Arab helpers. And that can help to make up for the discomfort in which a man will choose to spend his working life to wrest a secret from the past that the centuries have buried. For Geoffrey Bibby, toiling in the field of grave mounds, disappointment is routine.
Well, how are we? Oh. Can we take? I think take it that way if we can. Or yes. Let's see which way it swings. We may have to tip.
You have to help me that side.
We may have to tip it. Ah, it's moving. Mind your fingers.
What about you, Mr. You have to be there. You have to be there. Leave this.
I think yes. All right.
You have to be there.
Well,
Yeah, that's okay.
tip it towards you.
Yes.
Mind your fingers, sir. Yeah. Okay.
Is that okay?
Oh, it's been robbed. The sand's up to the roof.
All they found, in fact, was some pieces of bone and some tiny sherds of the familiar Barbar pottery. But no matter. Everything, however insignificant, must be documented and recorded. Geoffrey Bibby is content to be part of a small team from Denmark which has succeeded in putting Middle Eastern archaeology onto significantly new trails and courses. But away from the facts that he's helped to unearth, there's always time to speculate on the more romantic aspects of the work that may never reach the textbooks, but which have a place in man's imagination nonetheless.
There are so many parallels between the Sumerian account of Dilmun and the biblical story of the Garden of Eden that there can be no doubt at all that the two have a common origin. If you like, it would be quite possible to make a very good case for believing that for the last 15 years or so, we have been digging in the Garden of Eden itself.